I have a great honor to present you Marcin Piatkowski, who is our professor from Koźmiński University. Yes, and he also works as a senior economist in World Bank. He have a very good, a very interesting lecture about how we create a better world by 2050. I hope that is the better world for us and for our children. And Marcin, what I can say more, I can give you voice. So, Marcin,
Sure.
I'm waiting for your lecture.
Thanks a lot, Błażej, for introducing me. Hello to everyone from Washington, D.C. A lovely day here, beautiful blue skies and amazing greenery. So I'm really happy to be with you today. It's obviously a great honor and a privilege and a pleasure to share with you some of the insights and messages and some of my thinking that I have put into first my book on Europe's Growth Champion, published by Oxford University Press a few years back, as well as my work at the World Bank in China over the past 4 years, and research over the drivers of economic development. Next. So the main message that I want to share with you is pretty much a story of two amazing economic successes. One that we, I think, have heard a lot about, which is China, which over the last 40 years has been the fastest growing economy in the world and has increased its GDP per capita by 30 times, 30, but also a story of another country that I know quite well, which is Poland, which has become the European growth champion at the same time. And it's more than tripled its GDP per capita over the last 30 years, more than anyone else in Europe. But then the interesting question is, how come these countries have done so well over the past few decades, but they have not really done well for most of the history? And I researched this and tried to understand what were the drivers of the earlier failure to develop and their success, to answer the ultimate question for any economist, which is what makes countries rich and what keeps them poor. After all, there's fewer than 50 countries around the world today that we can consider high income, and 150 plus are still poor or are failing to catch up with the West. So the fundamental question is why some countries such as China and Poland have managed to get out of this trap of poverty, underdevelopment, and others haven't. And finally, what are the lessons learned from this experience? How should the world look like in 2050 if we can transport ourselves into the future? How should the world look like then, based on what principles, and what are the type of economic policies that are needed to reach that economic nirvana in the next 30 years? Next, please. So let me start by a slide that just provides evidence that indeed, over the last quarter of a century, China has by far been the fastest growing economy in the world. But then Poland was the fastest one in terms of growth relative to its global peers, because China is still a much poorer economy than Poland is. And because of various factors and the theory of conditional convergence, it is easier for poorer countries to grow faster. Poland has grown the fastest in Europe and also among all its global peers, that is, upper middle income and high income countries. Over the last 25 years, it's been more than 4% per year on average. Next. And that's also true for Europe. So since the fall of communism in Poland, and Poland was indeed the country that have spearheaded the fall of communism, it was not the fall of the Berlin Wall that spelled the end of this doctrine in the region. It was actually Poland that had the first democratic elections in '89 and was the first that started economic reforms that have actually allowed it to be the most successful economy in the region. So its GDP increased by almost 3 times, while at the same time, Germany's GDP per capita increased by only 40%. So it gives you an idea of this fundamental difference in growth. Next. And the interesting part is that there has been truly a fundamental historical change in the fate of countries, the economic fate of countries in Europe. Mere 30 years ago, an average Italian would have an income per capita more than 3 times higher than an average income in Poland. Today, the difference is less than 20%, and very likely by the end of this decade, 2030, Poland's level of income adjusted for purchasing power will reach that of Italy. And this will be the first time this will happen in virtually since the beginning of time, and even the Roman Empire. And the bad news is that it's largely happened because of economic stagnation in Italy over the last 2 decades, but it does not undermine the success of Poland and other Central European economies. Next. But importantly, I love a quote from Napoleon, the French emperor, who was fond of saying that history is a set of lies that we all agreed upon. What he meant by it is the history that we are being taught most of the time, including in all kinds of lectures, actually idealizes the past. It talks about the things that were positive, like the wars that Poland has won, and you heard it in the previous presentation, or by the wealth and the power of the countries. And this slide that shows the share of China's GDP in global GDP since year one is part of the story. So you ask any Chinese about how their economy has been doing over the last 2,000 years, they will mostly have this image in mind. Next. But the truth is, and no one really, or hardly anyone talks about it, is that for most of its history, both China and Poland were way behind the West in terms of development. So what this slide is showing you, that at least over the last 600 years plus, the average income in both countries, and that also reflects the region of Eastern Europe and East Asia as a whole, has always been significantly below the average income in the West, including in 19th century during the Industrial Revolution, where Poland and China were way behind with levels of income at about only 1/3 of what it was in the leading countries in the West, such as the UK. The big change only came after 1978 in China and after 1989 in Poland. But for all of its history, these countries were just simply economically backward. Next. So the question is, why were they so underdeveloped? Why we should not listen to this propaganda about the wealth and the success of these countries in the past? Economically speaking, it was simply not true. So these are the pictures of China in 1930s and a Polish village in 1930s in the eastern part of the country. It's not necessarily New York if you look at it closely. Next. So I set out in my book to try to explain what has kept these countries underdeveloped, and I have used an idea, a concept developed by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, and you might know their book "Why Nations Fail," which explains this theory, which pretty much says that the countries such as Poland and China did not develop in the past because they created extractive political and economic institutions that would keep these countries from growing. I would put it more simply, which is that extractive societies were societies ruled by a very narrow elite that did everything to benefit itself, but not the rest of the society. Next. Next, please. So there's a number of arguments for why Poland and China, and again, these are just proxies for a lot of countries in the region. Why they were not growing? Because the very narrow oligarchic and harmful elites at the very top of the society did everything to undermine the development of the rest of the other parts of the society. How did they do this? For instance, by restricting access to education. So, for instance, in 1750 in Poland, and there's no data, but China would be similar, only about 5% of the society, virtually the elites, were literate. The rest was just never had a chance to get educated. At the same time, more than 90% of the Dutch were literate. And again, you cannot explain the difference with the difference in the levels of incomes because all the countries had a very relatively similar level of income, but simply the elites did not want to give education to the poor and to the others because that could potentially in the future undermine their monopolistic hold on power. Next. They also made sure that the state could not intervene and undermine their monopoly. So, what did they do? They ensured that both the Polish state and the Chinese state, and it's an uncanny leg of difference here, is that both countries or both states had very little revenue. For instance, the Netherlands had 30 times more revenue per capita than China in 18th century, and was pretty much also the case for Poland. And finally, next slide. The elites have developed a very harmful anti-business, anti-science, and anti-innovation culture. They pretty much said that we need to keep the status quo. And you can even see it in these paintings. The two on the left are paintings by Rembrandt, a Dutch master painter, of a Dutch gentleman on a Polish nobleman in the middle, and then a Chinese aristocrat on the right. There were fundamental differences in not only how they dressed, but also how they thought and what they did and how they tried or not tried to promote development. Next. So what Acemoglu and Robinson did, they said that inclusive societies promote development and extractive societies ruled by the few for the benefit of the few undermine societies. But they did not really explain how you move from an inclusive or extractive, extractive to inclusive society. So this is how I have decided to modify and expand their theory and argue that unfortunately throughout history, the only way for countries to get rid of these oligarchic feudal elites is by violence. And don't get me wrong, I'm not here promoting violence. I'm just arguing that unfortunately, the only way to dislodge these elites in the past and move from an extractive to an inclusive society was through various forms of violence that was needed to dislodge the elites. Next. And indeed, when you look at the global map today of 45 countries that are high income, all the ones here in dark blue, next, you'll be actually surprised that if you do a typology of what were when and how they have become, or they started their journey to become high income, the vast majority of these countries, which is the column in the middle, had to go through a period of external shock, threat, or a pressure that was needed for these oligarchic elites to let go and allow the rest of the society to develop and flourish. Next. So, unfortunately, very often wars and occupations were exactly the external shocks that have helped remove the older elites. What was different about Eastern Europe in China, next slide, is the impact of communism. That was an external shock that was imposed in the case of Eastern Europe, on Eastern Europe, and it was adopted by China on its own. But there's a lot we can talk about communism, and obviously the social, political, and economic cost that it has inflicted on these countries. But at the same time, I argue that we have ignored some part of the benefits and unusual benefits of the system. Next. Which is just communism was a quintessential external shock that allowed for Eastern Europe, Poland and Eastern Europe, and for China to bulldoze, get rid of all these feudal extractive institutional structures and for the first time built an open, egalitarian, socially mobile, and industrialized country. Next. And in fact, when you look at the data, this one is, for instance, about the share of the top 1% of the richest Poles in the income in GDP from 1890 to 2050. You can actually see this huge fall in the income of the elites that happened after the imposition of communism in 1945. And the same goes for China in the next slide. When the land reform in 1949 have actually virtually averaged out all the land holdings. So there were no more aristocrats that would own hundreds and thousands of hectares of land. It was all distributed to smallholders, and it was exactly this kind of radical reform that was needed to undermine these old elites and then create a totally new society. Next. Now, planned economy until 1978 and until 1989 in Poland and in China did not work well. In Poland, it ended up with an economic stagnation and bankruptcy. In China, it cost millions of people's lives during Cultural Revolution and the leap forward early in the 60s. And in fact, but because of these two individuals, Wałęsa, who started the Solidarity movement and was the key architect of the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and Deng Xiaoping in China, on your right, were the two architects of fundamental reforms that happened over the last 30 and 40 years. Next. These were the reforms that allowed Poland, and this is a picture of a Polish store from 1988, and one of these nice ladies, babushkas, could easily be my own grandma, who I remember standing in long lines to try to buy kielbasa and pierogi that you heard about in the previous lecture. But then, because of these reforms that happened post-communism, Poland has moved from these empty stores in 1988 to, next slide please, to what it is today. The most successful economy in Europe in terms of growth over the last 30 years, and pretty much a Western economy with a Western quality of life at half price. And the same happened for China. Next picture, please. This is a picture from one of the close suburbs of Beijing from 1978. In fact, the beginning of Deng Xiaoping reforms. China then was unrecognizable to what it is today. Next. This is my own picture from my last holidays in Sanya, in a beautiful Hainan Island in the south of China, where there were more Rolls Royces, Ferraris, and Porsches that you can actually find probably in any country that you are from. Next. So, based on this experience of countries like China and Poland as a proxy for a lot of other poor countries, they've been economically backward for pretty much 2,000 years of their history, but over the last 40 and 30 years, they have developed beyond expectations, and Poland has already become high income, and China will become high income based on the World Bank definition within the next few years. So what are the lessons learned for others, and how could it inform our view about how shall we design the world when we have this lecture again in 2050 to make sure that the world will go in the right direction and not be at the end, at the precipice, and in the picture here. Next. So philosophers starting from Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and everyone else from the very beginning were asking what makes people happy and what is the meaning of life. And there's no time today to talk about all these philosophical concepts, but the one I truly like the most is a concept by an American philosopher, John Rawls, which developed the idea of a veil of ignorance, which says that we would want to design the world in a way as if we put ourselves outside of the earth in space, and we would need to design the world from scratch without knowing who we would be in this world. what race we would have, what parents we would have, what nationality we would have, what genes we would have, what abilities we would have. And that perspective, because you don't know whether you would end up being a poor Tanzanian or Bolivian, or a rich daughter or son, or a New York billionaire, you would really need this kind of approach of veil of ignorance forces you to think what are the fundamental values and principles that would be needed to design this new world. And the big question would be, what are these values? And then you can argue that, you know, there's a concept of Western values that I think a lot of us could identify with, but others, such as in China, would say we are not into Western values. We have our own Chinese values that we like more. And then you can argue, you can be a relativist and say, look, there's just no single definition of values that we as humankind promote. So let's just everyone do what they want to do. But then I think this is not exactly true, because we as humankind have already agreed on a set of values that should drive our development and that should decide what our world should look like. And the way we have all that, or what we have agreed on, next slide, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we, as the virtually all countries in the world, have signed back in 1948, which spells out 35 short paragraphs of what it is that we all agreed upon in terms of the values, the fundamental human values that we all agreed to promote, from social, economic, environmental, to all other values that really make us who we are, human beings. Next. And anyone can also interpret the values in a somewhat different way, although they are, I think, pretty straightforward. To me, the bottom line, the summary of these values is the following: that we need to create a world by 2050 that will maximize people's potential to self-realize their dreams and to maximize and fully leverage their capacities. And this is for every single individual in the world, regardless if they were born in Tanzania, Bolivia, Bangladesh, or New York. We have to create a system that is in principle equal, or gives equal chances to all human beings around the world. And one of the critical parts that would need to happen, in my view, and I think we can all largely agree on it, or we can have a discussion later on, which is eliminate poverty, reduce inequality, and a couple of other things also in political sphere that will need to happen for this better world by 2050 to happen. Next. And I think particularly all of you that are listening to me right now from around the world, you know, you are already successful businessmen, and you will be even more successful in the future, also thanks to this prestigious and very useful MBA program. But I think we have a moral and economic and social responsibility to fight for the world that there will be no poor people left anymore. As you can see in the slide, we've been extremely successful over the last 40, 50 years in reducing global poverty, which has decreased from more than 40% decades ago to about 10% now. But 10% of mankind is still 800 million people plus that live in extreme poverty, defined as having income of less than $1.9 per day. And I don't think we can have a clear conscience living our good lives and having nice EMBA courses without thinking how we can ensure that this 800 billion will be lifted out of poverty by 2050, because otherwise the world will never be equal and will never be in line with the fundamental values we have agreed on. Next. And I think it's also critical to reduce global inequality, to make sure that that inequality both between countries and within countries, so between Republic of Congo in Africa and Norway, and the difference in income is 50 times, as well as the difference in income within countries, or the fact that in South Africa, Brazil, Botswana, most of the pie, most of GDP that is created is every year appropriated by only a very small part of the society. So the good news is that mostly because of the rise of China and India, which you can see in this famous elephant chart on your left, because of their economic success over the past 40 years, the incomes of the global poor middle class in India and China has grown much faster than elsewhere. And it has allowed for global inequality on your right hand side, particularly the population weighted inequality, to decline. But at the same time, next slide, inequalities within countries have increased. And I could have a separate lecture just to talk about inequality, but let me just show you this slide that shows one could argue that America has become a plutocracy, in a sense, an oligarchic society where very few people, very thin elites, control most of the income and wealth in the country. So, for instance, the wealth, as you can see in the slide, the wealth of the richest 400 Americans represents more than 20% of American GDP. And you may wonder, why does it matter? It matters, next slide, please, because billionaires are not just sitting there and voting and have one vote like we all do. They've actually used their political and economic power to create a system that sustains the status quo and allows them to continue to be elites and increasingly remove themselves from the rest of the society. And one way through which this is happening is the fall in tax rates on these rich. So this is a slide that shows the decline of the tax rates on the richest Americans from 70% in 1950s to less than 20% today, which means that a lot of billionaires, a lot of richest Americans and others all around the world, because of various changes that have happened over the past 50 years, are now often paying less tax in proportion to their income than the poor. Next. And that matters because all of these changes in tax rates have led to higher inequality. And again, this is an example of the US, where the share of income taken over by the top 1% richest Americans, and other countries would have roughly similar pictures, have risen from less than 12% to more than 20% by now, while the income of the poorest Americans have continued to decline. Next. And finally, so one would say, why do you care about this inequality if these people have earned all these billions? It actually matters because indeed, increasing inequality undermines social mobility. It means that in an ideal society, the income of our parents should not decide our own future, the future of their kids. But unfortunately, this is not the case, and it's less and less the case worldwide, and particularly in the United States. If you are unlucky to be born to the wrong parents, poor ones who live in the wrong area, you will never have a chance to get to Harvard. And that's very unfortunate because Einsteins are born for all kinds of levels of income, and we're losing millions of talents every year because there's just no chance for them to develop because of the system. Next. And at the same time, we are being told, and it's this lovely picture from the 1980s, that reducing taxes is good for everyone because this wealth will trickle down. Unfortunately, that has not happened, and the wealth has trickled down to the wealthy, and there was nothing left for the very poor. Next. And interestingly enough, and that's another topic for a debate, and please let's have follow up questions. China, despite being a communist country, has actually a level of inequality which is pretty much the same as in the United States. The share of the top 1% in income in China, even particularly adjusted for a lot of income and wealth, which is hidden from the tax authorities, is virtually no different than America. So it is already a pretty unequal society where the top 1% of the elites that have benefited the most from the transition of the last 40 years are increasingly affecting how the society looks like. And finally, next slide. We obviously all know about the need to save our planet and fight climate change. It's definitely one of the keys, if not to survival. I am not one of those Armageddonists who argue that our kids won't have a chance to live, that the end of the world is near. That's simply not true. But clearly, we need to do all our best to move from what was, for instance, Beijing like a few years back. And this is this picture of Beijing a few years back and the air pollution that was just simply choking everyone off. And I remember it myself versus the blue skies in Beijing today. So this is a nice example of what needs to be done, but much more it's still left to be done. Next slide.
Meantime, I will ask you one question from the chat.
Yes, please.
To fight bureaucracy, America and the world measure like tax the rich. Innovates are the best in your view. If not, what other measure could be implemented? So tax for the rich.
Sure.
Yes.
It's a very good question. I think there are two ways of dealing with this problem, at least two. One is to ensure that the society is more equal even before intervening with higher taxes. What it means is that we already need to ensure that kids have the same, in principle, the same access to high quality education, that the labor markets are truly open, that the product markets are open so that everyone can come in and become a successful entrepreneur, regardless of who you know and who your parents are and what kind of a contacts that you have developed. Because fundamentally, the way we can fix societies in America and worldwide is by giving everyone, in principle, because ideally no one can ever have the same chances, but give them the same chances to flourish from early level education, but which is particularly important for the poor kids with parents who are just way too busy to take care of them. So from early child education through elementary and high school, these are the critical parts that all the societies, particularly developed societies and in America too, should invest in to ensure that, again, if you're a poor boy or a poor girl, the wealth of your parents should not decide what kind of quality of education you're going to get. So that's one part of the equation. The second one is the market system will never be ideal. In fact, the market system, the way it works, is that fundamentally it ends up creating elites anyway. And these elites also have a tendency to self-perpetuate themselves, even without doing it on purpose. You know, myself, I have 3 kids and I want them to go to the best school possible. And I know that I mean well for my kids, but by sending them to the best schools I can afford, I immediately make them privileged versus the kids that were less lucky in life than I was. So I would want the global system to mitigate the luck that I had in my life to be wealthy and to have high income, and then distribute income from people like myself to people that for various reasons were simply less lucky, but they also deserve a chance to flourish. Thank you. Let me, if I can go back to slides and we can pick up another question.
Yes, of course.
So on China, despite the success that have happened, there's clearly still a lot to go. And I in my second job as a World Bank economist, I'm also helping China to develop new ways of how to accelerate green development to ensure that China's emissions, which are the largest in the world, will peak as soon as possible and then will start falling as quickly as possible in the near future. Next. Next slide, please. Okay, so fundamentally, among all of the things that we need to focus on as we go forward to 2050, and it's only less than 29 years away, which is that we should not forget that the ultimate goal of economic development, of GDP growth, is just not to make more money, it's really to be more happy. And I think it's also a question mark for countries such as China, which has been amazingly successful in economic development. But based on global surveys that ask citizens of China and citizens of 160 countries around the world how happy you are, the Chinese are actually not that happy. They're, in fact, significantly less happy than Costa Ricans, who have a similar level of income, and actually most of Latin America, who have significantly who have the same or lower level of income already today, but are significantly happier. So I think there's a lot of discussion that needs to go into economic thinking going forward, how to go beyond just growth for the sake of growth, and how to ensure that this growth translates into true changes in the quality of life and well-being. Next. And in fact, Poland in that way is a good example of a country that has been able to transform rising incomes into higher quality of life. So if you take, for instance, the OECD ranking of quality of life called Better Life Index, Poland in this ranking, you see the two red boxes, Poland, despite being 1/3 less rich on average than South Korea, actually has a higher quality of life, well-being than our Korean friends, which suggests that some countries are better and some countries are worse in translating income into what really matters. So finally, next please. So what I wanted to share with you today, it's a bit of a Hollywood-like story of two economic laggards, China and Poland, that for 2,000 years economically were mostly way behind the West, a few long steps behind the most developed countries in the world. But then over the last 40 and 30 years, both of these countries have become respectively the world's and Europe's growth champions. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from their experience. And one of them, the controversial lesson, is that these countries and many others have had to go through a period of an external shock that was needed to make these countries inclusive, to create egalitarian, socially mobile societies where even the poor had a chance to be successful. And finally, so how should the world look like by 2050, as in the title of this lecture? I think it should not be guided by Western values, because if I were not Western, I would immediately dispute whether there are anything like Western values and whether these are the values that I would agree with. But we have agreed of universal values as part of the United Nations, and we know what are the things that we all care about in economic sphere, in a social sphere, in environment, and in political rights. And I think the UN Declaration of Human Rights should become a much better guidance, or should become the scorecard for the future, going way beyond GDP. And in the meantime, and I hope everyone joins me in this work over the next 30 years, we just need to do everything, not just focus on our work every day, but we really need to help others, all the poorest people in the world, to have a chance to join an EMBA class like ours in the future, to reduce inequality because it undermines social mobility, and finally promote happiness, because without happiness, all economic growth doesn't make any sense. So good luck to everyone, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Marcin, very much. I don't see any question more here. Okay, you see me. It was very interesting, yes. Totally the new point of view on it, which I don't see it as, but I'm the finance guy. So for me, it's now only important, not the higher future.
Sure.
So
Let's see if anyone has who is online and who wants to ask a question. The
May I
first
ask a
one,
question?
yes,
May I ask a question?
yes,
yes, sir, David.
And thank you, Marcin, very much indeed for a fascinating insight. Can I just tease down a little bit into what you were saying about the need to create a more fair and equal society? And for me, one of the absolute essentials is the role of women, not just education, but emancipation. And where we see, going back to that photograph of the leaders having a good laugh back in the 1980s or whatever it was, all men, all Westerners, and we are men here. The majority of us doing the EMBA program is men. So how practically, okay, if you agree with me that that is one of the vital changes that we need to make, how do we start that process and drive it forward?
Certainly, and a very good question. Thank you. And there's another one from Alicia also on
yes,
expectations for Africa. And I think my short answer would be women rights are human rights. I think there's just simply obviously absolutely no reason to discriminate and against anyone based on any basis. And in that way, any measures that are being taken, and particularly the West, but also a lot of other increasing a lot of other countries around the world, have taken all types of measures to ensure that we are treated equally, regardless of our gender. And that's clearly something that still needs to be promoted and is a never-ending agenda. And that in particular also applies to Africa, where I think in many countries, women's rights are still not where they should be. And in terms of expectations for Africa, making sure that women have a voice, making sure that women can contribute to development, making sure that women can actually have time to help educate their kids, but at the same time realize their professional dreams is simply critical. In terms of future of Africa, I think in many ways the West in Asia, there's very little poverty left in these countries, and I think overall, broadly speaking, they are on a developmental trajectory. I think the key question, as Alicia rightly pointed out, or the key question mark for the future for 2050 is what will happen to Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where most of 800 million poor people live today. And I think my answer would be I'm not overly optimistic because a lot of these countries, there were many false dawns in the past. And it's really hard for them to develop for all kinds of reasons, from ethnic diversity through lack of capital, corruption, geographically not necessarily great location. So I think it will be difficult. But that said, our responsibility is to do everything that we can to help. For instance, being a person that has worked with the Chinese government on helping it develop, I'm personally a great supporter of a Belt and Road Initiative that is of spending money, investing money in poor countries around the world in building basic infrastructure. I mean, all these countries in Africa will simply not develop without bridges, without roads, without railways, and without tramways and electricity. So I would love for the rest of the world, America and the European Union and everyone else, to have its own response, if they will, to the BRI and invest billions of dollars into these countries. And if America, for instance, can spend $5 billion on stimulating the economy after the COVID or during the COVID crisis, I would not understand why we cannot spend only 10% of this to invest in infrastructure in the poor countries of the world, such as those in Africa. Thank you.
we have another two questions. What are the fast track way to leverage, diversify, and inclusion in addition to quality globally? Yes, from Crystal. And also question from William, which is connected to the question about the Africa. Most countries in most countries in South America are moving to socialism. Do you think is a good sign? I would say not only in America but also in Europe, that most countries are going to socialism. I suppose also the Canada is going in this way. Yeah.
Very good questions. Thank you. On diversity and inclusion, I think that I'm not sure there's a fast track, but if there was one, and let me repeat myself, I think education is clearly a key. This is the best way. Education is starting virtually from the kids are born, when they are born. We as global governments, we have to invest much more in ensuring that the kids get proper education and care from the very beginning. And even in the US, you will be surprised that virtually there's no support for anyone with kids below the age of 5. You have to send them to a private kindergarten because there are no public ones. So if you happen to be a poor American and if you have to have 2 jobs to make ends meet, immediately your child is having much harder chances to flourish in life. And we know from economic research and psychological and neuroscience research that the first 5 years of a child's life are absolutely critical to his or her development. So if we underinvest in this development in developed countries and in poor countries around the world, that undermines diversity, inclusion, development, and happiness right at the bat. Now, on socialism in South America, well, that's a nicely loaded question. But I don't think Latin America is really socialist. I think one of the reasons why Latin America, except for Chile, has not really done well economically is I think it has always had a problem with inclusion and with education. One could argue controversially that still a lot of American countries are controlled by a very thin elites. I remember having a lecture in Colombia or in Mexico a few years back, and I was shocked to learn that in Colombia, 1% of the society, of the richest, still controls more than half of the land in the country. And all this 1% are the science of the conquistadors and Pizarro. So I think Latin America in many ways has never shed the legacy of conquistadors and the legacy of these oligarchic societies driven by very thin elites. And even today, the quality of education and access to high quality of education in most countries in Latin America is just simply a lot to say. It's simply just unequal. So I think one of the challenges for all of these countries in the future will be more socialist actually in providing education, high quality education to everyone. And I hope this happens. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Marcin. We have all the questions which you answer. So thank you very much. And I think, guys, ladies and gentlemen, there is any other questions?
If there's any other questions, I've left my contacts. Please Google me. You can find my email there. It's the first letter of my name and the full last name, Piatkowski at World Bank or at kozmiński.edu.pl. I also have my own website, marcinpiatkowski.com, and I'm pretty active on Twitter. So please engage with me if you have any more questions, and hope to stay in touch virtually or in person. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can't hear you, David. Cannot hear you.
Thank you, Marcin. Thank you, Blazit, for a very,
Thank you
very
very much.
interesting presentation.
Thanks for taking care so well of the slides and of the preparation. I appreciate it. A lot of hours of work, and I can only be grateful for this. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say to everybody else who's listening to this that the next session on the subject of the British monarchy takes place on Zoom. So if you go back into your timeline and click on the next presentation, you will see on the right the link that you need to copy and paste in to join that within Zoom. That begins in 11 minutes time on the hour, and I hope you will attend. Tomorrow we have lots more sessions, including, of course, our virtual safari. So I hope that, and also a tour of the Everglades. So I hope you'll be able to join us in your numbers then. And we look forward to seeing you then. So for the moment, just head back to the timeline and join the next session about the British monarchy, if you want to, at on the hour in Zoom. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.